Well, hello everyone. This is Carrie Beck with How to Homeschool My Child and Raising Leaders. And I'm excited that you're here with me today. We've got a lot in store for you, so we're going to go ahead and get started with Start Homeschool Right in 2017, How to Raise Leaders and Not Followers. Before we do get started, a few housekeeping things. If you're there are two ways that you might get bounced off or having some issues. One, your sound might not be as loud as it needs to be. So just check your sound if you can't hear me, or put some earbuds on, and that'll sort of get rid of all the extra noise in your house. Secondly, what we have found is if you have a lot of tabs open, those tabs can sometimes mess with the video and bounce you off. I like to multitask personally, but I have found that when I am on a webinar or workshop of some sort, I need to close my tabs and focus on that, because otherwise I will get bounced off. So let's go ahead and get started. This is Start Homeschool Right in 2017. And some of you know me and some of you don't, but you may be going, who is Carrie Beck and why should I listen to her? Well, I know the conveyor belt system well, and I'm going to be talking about what that is in education and how you probably know it as well as I do. You just may not realize the terms. In 2003, I read a book called A Thomas Jefferson Education. And it really sparked some thoughts in me. And I knew I wanted to do something differently with my kids. So I spent 4 or 5 years implementing it from a Christian perspective, because I think it's real important that everything I do go through a biblical perspective. And that's one thing that people have a problem with the Thomas Jefferson education. It's not from a Christian perspective. And so the things I share today and the things that I share in Raising Leaders, Not Followers, go through the grid of scripture. I just want you to know from the outset that's where I'm coming from. And this really did change my approach. I'd always been eclectic, but now I felt like I had a larger purpose. So I experimented and I implemented leadership education to the best of my ability. And one reason I give this workshop is I don't want you to have to struggle with all the things I did for those, 5 or 6 years. So I want to share with you some things that really worked to give my kids a godly character foundation, a love of learning, and the tools of learning from a Christian perspective. Now, John Maxwell says the proof of leadership is found in the followers. My friend says the proof is in the pudding. So who are your followers? Let me just share with you a little bit about me. This is my family. These are my kids, and they are the proof in the pudding. Where are they and what's going on? Let me see if I can nope, can't get the mouse to work. Ashley and Jesse are on the left side, and I guess I need to update this picture because it doesn't have my other son-in-law, but Ashley and Jesse are on the left. She's my oldest. Ashley, growing up, she questioned her teachers, and she would give answers with support, even answers that had a biblical support, but her teachers wouldn't accept it because it wasn't the answer in the textbook. Hunter is on the right-hand side, and he's our youngest. He works in Houston. Ashley and Jesse live in Austin, and she works at their church, and he works at Samsung. Hunter is on the right, and he was always asking questions. He's never been embarrassed to ask a question. Questions that he would, even when he was 13 years old, I don't know what that word means, Mom, in front of his friends and everything. So then Gentry in the middle, and then she's next to their cousin, David, who happened to be there with us that day. She just tended to have people follow her. She has a personality that tends to be a leader. But I will say now, all 3 of my kids are leaders now. They may or may not have been when they were growing up. Leadership takes time, and too often we want our kids to love learning instantly. I've tried this for a year and it's not working. I'm going to tell you right now, Ashley didn't like to read, and Hunter did not like to read. They both like to read now. Gentry was a voracious leader, but she was not a good speller, and yet she knows how to spell, and if she doesn't, she can compensate. But all 3 of them now are leaders in different ways. Hunter calls himself a servant leader, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that as well. But and they've all worked in business, and I feel like they've done some non-traditional things. Ashley got her college degree in 1.5 years, and I believe that gave her a real education. She really had to think through things. They all have those tools of learning, those study skills. In fact, Gentry told me in college, Mom, thank you for the tools that you gave me in high school to learn, because I can learn anything now. My friends that went to regular school, they really struggle a lot in college because they only knew how to study for what was being given to them. And you gave me the tools that could go across the board. And then the little picture on the right, that's my granddaughter, and Faith, and we have another granddaughter, and that's also just 4 months old. And that's one of the reasons that I give these workshops, that I still work with homeschoolers. I want homeschooling to still be available for my grandkids. Now, whether my kids homeschool or not, that's not for me to say. That's their decision between their spouse and God. But I do want it to be available for them. So let's get going and see what we're going to cover. There's a lot. And you can see at the beginning, I'm going to talk about one simple activity, develop a love of learning. A lot of things in the your kids, save yourself some hassle, making homeschooling easy, the 3 R's. They're not the 3 R's you think. But ending up with how to give your kids the tools of learning for a lifetime. Because I feel like these are two things that homeschool moms have told me they struggle with, motivating their kids to love learning and not just going through the routine of a textbook. So another thing I do want to mention is there is still time today to enter our giveaway. I'm giving away 2 copies of Raising Leaders, Not Followers, and you have till Wednesday to enter that. Just registering for this workshop is one way that you can enter that as well. And then I'm also going to be showing you some ways that you can save some money at the end of this workshop. Well, let's get started and let's talk about what type of education your child is receiving. We want one class to have a liberal education. We want another class, a very much larger class of necessity, to forego the privilege of a liberal education and fit themselves to perform specific, difficult manual tasks. Who said that? You might be surprised, but it was the President of the United States in the early 20th century. Woodrow Wilson, this is his goal for public education. We're going to have a small group that's going to get the best education, the privilege of a liberal education. And that's not liberal in the way we're thinking politics. Liberal education means you liberate your children or the student from the teacher. You give them the tools of learning and a love of learning so that they can have a lifetime of learning. That's a liberal or a freedom education. That's a small group of people in his eyes, and we want a larger class of people to be able to just take care of manual tasks. Now, I would say manual tasks, as you learn in a little bit, is not just digging ditches, but sitting at a computer running a spreadsheet. It's things that we do over and over, and we really don't have much say about what we do with our time. And so I really think he was in charge, really wanting a bunch of worker bees. The Industrial Revolution had just come about. They needed workers, whether they were accountants or whether they were electricians or car mechanics or doctors. We needed workers to fill the workforce. And that bothers me. So let's take a look at what are the types of education. The first one I want to talk about is the conveyor belt education. This teaches simply what to think. And I think this is what most of us receive. It's basically a factory school. It's the education of history for the public, because the public needed some sort of education. And so the government said, okay, we will give them an education so that they can be productive in society and have a job. And basically you start at station 1 and everyone does the same activities and they are tested and stamped correctly at station 1 on that conveyor belt. And then if they are stamped and approved, they move to station 2. Do all the same things to get through station 2. They're stamped for approval. They move to station 3. There are 12 stations. When they finish the stations on the conveyor belt, they are ready for the market, the job market. And that's really what public education is about. And a lot of private schools too, because private school tends to follow some of what the public schools are doing as well. This is simply what to think, especially according to John Gatto, who was New York State Teacher of the Year, and it appalled him. And he started doing some research about what was going on and how we could correct it. There's a quote from Manchester Online that I would like to share with you, and it says, "The fear of failure and conveyor belt education, so common in the UK. It's not just the United States, the UK too. They're creating a mindset that means young people are more inclined to play things safe rather than to look for opportunities. We need to create a culture where young people are actively encouraged to turn their own ideas into reality." The report said rules-based education, hierarchical workplaces crush the enterprise spirit. And I would say they crush the creative spirit, and they crush the love of learning. And so that is what conveyor belt education is about. You do gain things, but it's just what to think. The next type of education is the competitive conveyor belt education. And I would compare this to colleges, universities, and trade schools. You still have a set book of knowledge, and it's very competitive. You know, not everyone can go to college. Not everyone can do this, that, or the other. And so you're basically taught when to think. So if you take your car into the mechanic and you're having this problem, he's like, "Oh, I know what that is. That is your engine," or whatever part of the engine it is. He can diagnose what's wrong. But it's also in the medical field. Doctors are on a competitive conveyor belt because they are told what to think. I've got this nodule on my neck that's sticking out. What's wrong? Oh, that's, and he can diagnose what's wrong and help you fix it. So there's a wide variety of things on that competitive conveyor belt. And Michael Lesker of the Baltimore Sun had this to say about it. He went to the University of Maryland at College Park. "When I went there, students tended to call the place the factory." This was not intended as a compliment. It felt like conveyor belt education. The administration didn't care about names. They gave you a student number. Sound familiar? Mine was 054728. I still carry it in my head like a scar that doesn't quite heal. Both of these are conveyor belt, and they really do train your kids for factory type jobs, whether it's warehouse, accounting, specialized factory, it doesn't matter. They are not learning to make decisions for themselves. And that, to me, is what leadership education is about. And it's teaching our kids how to think. And the rest of this workshop is I'm going to give you ideas on the tools of learning, love of learning, but then also the foundation of learning as well, so that you can use those to raise your kids to be godly leaders. The Bible has a lot to say about leadership education. You may not realize that. And like I said earlier, whenever I pursue something, I want to compare it to the grid of Scripture, just like the leadership education that I talk about in Raising Leaders, Not Followers. I think it's important that Christians become leaders and pass on leadership down onto their kids. The Kennedys have done a great job of this. They make sure that their kids are in place to take leadership when they pass on. Why aren't Christians making sure that their kids are in leadership when they pass on? In Exodus 33:11, it says, "So the Lord spoke to Moses face to face, as a man speaks to his friend, and he would return to the camp. But his servant Joshua, the son of Nun, a young man, did not depart from the tabernacle." You see, Joshua stayed at the tabernacle, and he prepared as a leader after Moses. What are you doing to prepare your kids to be like Joshua, to follow your example? We're all setting an example. Believe it or not, your kids are all following you. And I'll share some ideas later on of how my kids have followed me. But your kids are going to follow your example. Are they going to follow it in biblical, godly way, in the way of leaders, in being a leader for Christ? Now, I normally don't talk about this, but it's really made me think this year. There is still a place for followers because we are all followers of Jesus Christ. And some of you might be thinking that. Yes, we are followers and we follow Jesus Christ, but he gives us the ability to live for Him. And what are some of those things? Why do we even raise leaders? If we're a follower of Christ and we need to learn to be followers, why should we raise our kids to be leaders? One, I would say positive impact on society. Not just a positive impact, but a godly impact, so that we are ruling and reigning for Jesus Christ. The impact that our kids will have as leaders will impact those around them. Maybe it's just their neighbors next door. Maybe it's their office mate. Maybe it's their coworker. But they are able to rule for Jesus Christ, maybe just over their family to rule and reign, but maybe over their department, maybe as a leader in their neighborhood. There's a lot of ways that we can rule and reign for Jesus Christ. It's not just being mayor of the city or president of the United States. It could be as business leaders, as entrepreneurs. I can tell you that we vote on city council people, but the ones that have the most impact in our community are the entrepreneurs, are the business leaders. They are the ones that are the movers and the shakers. So why not do that from a godly perspective? It gives them the freedom to call their own shots. And you may think, well, that sounds sort of selfish. Well, not really, because if we have freedom in our life and we are not slaves to the conveyor belt, then we can have an impact on what's going around. We also have freedom to spend time with our own children. We have freedom to make an impact in our society. I think it also honors God for us to be able to raise our kids as leaders and for our kids to be godly leaders. We need to also remember that if we are going to raise leaders, for our kids to lead tomorrow, you must learn today. This is so important. And that's why I think it's important in homeschooling. It's all about learning and academics. So why not do it from a biblical perspective? So we want our kids to learn today and to learn for the rest of their lives. And so I want to give you some practical ways. Let's start with leaders. Leaders reproduce themselves. You either do this through modeling or mentoring or a combination. And what I want to talk to you is usually the younger kids you're going to model for them, and they're watching everything you do and copying. Mentoring is more coming alongside. That's going to be the second half of this workshop, coming alongside and mentoring our kids so that they are working more independently and you are giving them those tools of learning. There really is no success without a successor, and it does take a lot of hard work, and it takes a lot of time. Like I said earlier, some of the challenges, for those of you that didn't know, we had a 5-day challenge last week, and I asked homeschool moms to say, what's your biggest challenge? A lot of them was, I tried this last year and it's not working, so I'm going to try that this coming year. Well, it takes time to make changes. I got my master's in education, and one of the classes we talked about was the changes in public education, and they never let anything take root long enough to see a real change. They'll let it last for about 5 or 6 years, and that's really not long enough to see change. And I think that's true in homeschool as well. Giving your kids a love of learning doesn't just happen overnight. It takes a lifetime, really. It takes the whole time that they are with you. So I think that's real important that we give ourselves time. David had his mighty men. He was a leader. He modeled bravery, I would say. He started at a young age with Goliath, and he lived it out. And then he had his mighty men that were following him. For those of you that are football fans, and if you're moms, there may not be as many, but I'm a huge football fan. One of the great coaches was a man named Bill Walsh. In 1988, when Bill Walsh was coaching, there were 10 NFL coaches, head coaches, that had spent time under Bill Walsh. I would say he reproduced himself very well. He was a leader that other people followed. He reproduced himself, and they went on to be coaches at other teams. So where do we start? I would say the very beginning is you need to lay a firm foundation. What is that foundation of? It is of godly character. And if you have little kids, this is where you need to start. If your children are older and they do not have a good foundation of godly character, this is where you need to start. Let me repeat. All kids, and even older ones, you need to take a break from academics and spend some time working on godly character. If your kids don't have a good work ethic, if they aren't persevering, if they are not free from anger, if they do not humble themselves, this is where we need to start. Now, we're all sinners. We're not perfect. I understand that. But I'm saying kids that are working on it, if you are constantly all day long dealing with an anger issue, you need to take a step back and deal with that before you start to give them a love of learning and the tools of learning. So let's talk about laying a firm foundation of character. This is righteous character. God gives us the breastplate of righteousness, and we need to teach our kids how to put on the uniform that God gave us, the breastplate of righteousness. And that breastplate is used with the belt of truth. And the belt of truth is all founded in God's word, which is the only truth that we have. And we need to be teaching our kids the truth in God's word. How do we use that belt of truth? That's part of the uniform. And then the breastplate of righteousness. In Genesis 18:19, it says, "For I have known him in order that he may command his children and his household after him, that they keep the way of the Lord." To do what? To do righteousness and justice, that the Lord may bring to Abraham what he has spoken to him. Righteousness and justice, that's what we want to do. And he's talking to Abraham about this. A strong character will see your kids through the rest of their lives. So spend time at a young age developing that character: humility, truthfulness, perseverance, independent work, integrity, bravery. And I can tell you for a fact that my kids have had ups and downs with godly character, and we've all struggled. We all struggle with our walk, but we've had some difficult times in our lives this past year. I'm not going to go through it, but we've had some grief that we've had to deal with. And I've watched my kids cling to God and go back to this righteous behavior. Look to the Bible, look to the truth, that belt of truth, how they should live, and then make choices to live righteously with that breastplate of righteousness. So it's really important. I think it will take your kids through at any time. And my kids are 24, 27, and 29. And, they have ups and downs, but they are clinging to God. I think a lot of it has to do with the firm foundation that we gave them. I think in that, one way that we can be leaders is the servant leader. I mentioned that about Hunter because he won an award as being a leader in his school as a senior athlete. And when they came to interview him, the TV station, he called himself, because, well, really, I'm more of a servant leader. And I think it's important that we teach our kids that part of leadership is serving, not necessarily just that following, but truly serving others. One way we did this with our kids was to go on mission trips. We took them down into the heart of Mexico, and I think to this day, still have a heart for missions because of those mission trips that we went to. And I would really encourage you to find mission trips. They might be domestic trips here in the United States, or they might be overseas. My kids, Ashley and Hunter, have both gone with me down to El Salvador, and Gentry and Andrew are planning on that. But this is a group of kids that we work with down in El Salvador. I still go on mission trips. Last January, they were getting ready to start their new school year in January, and we gave awards to all the kids that had 90% or greater, the ones that we sent as scholarship students. And out of 25 kids, these are the ones that had all A's, basically. And I wanted you to know something, that anytime that you support How to Homeschool My Child, all our profits go to the Shelter the Homeless. We pay our expenses, but all our profits go to Shelter the Homeless down in El Salvador. And you're helping these kids as well. But Find ways that you can go on a mission trip where your kids can actually serve others. I remember Hunter painting a wall when he was like 5 years old down in Mexico. I remember Ashley and Gentry playing softball with the kids and playing soccer with the kids before we went to Vacation Bible School. They were a magnet for kids because they were a kid themselves. You know, they were 8 or 10 years old. It was a cool time. So that's one way you can do that. Matthew 23:11 says, "He who is greatest among you shall be your servant." So if you have a child in your family that serves their siblings, I would encourage you to exalt them. They're being unselfish. Maybe they can choose the weekend activity, or maybe they can choose what we're going to have for dinner tonight, or maybe the rest of the family serves that child because of their humble spirit. So that's another way you can do it. And see, we can take a scripture and apply it very specifically. I think it's important that we teach our kids to control their emotions, and they are free from anger, Proverbs 22:24 says, "Make no friendship with an angry man, and with a furious man do not go." If your kids have friends that are angry all the time, you might need to limit the time that they play with them. Or maybe your child is angry all the time. Maybe you need to limit them from the time they play with their siblings. Proverbs 16:32 says, "He who is slow to anger is better than the mighty. He who rules his spirit than he who takes the city." So maybe if you're slow to anger, you're better than the mighty. Might give an award, because the one who takes the city gets an award. If you look in history, when you win a city, you're the one that's on the place of honor coming into back home. And so a person that rules his spirit is greater than that. So maybe give an award for controlling your anger. Oh, wait, one more verse. Psalm 37:9 says, "For evildoers shall be cut off, but those who wait on the Lord, they shall inherit the earth." That idea of wait is so hard for Americans. We want everything so quickly. But it's important that we learn to wait on the Lord. And it says they shall inherit the earth. Maybe start a long-term savings account for your kids. And when you see them waiting on the Lord, when you see them being patient and free from anger, deposit some money in that savings account. We set up a savings account for each of our kids that they were able to use as adults. Self-discipline is another character quality. And Dwight Eisenhower says there are no victories at bargain prices. It's not easy to have a victory. We need discipline. And I would say success does not come instantly, like ATMs, instant breakfast, or fast food. We need to teach our kids to discipline themselves, to have control over their emotions. And that is their responsibility. If we don't, then our kids' emotions have power over them, and they are not in control of themselves, and they're going to live a very frustrated life. You know, frustration means unmet expectations. And when we don't have self-discipline, we have a lot of unmet expectations. The Greek philosopher Epictetus says, "No person is free who is not master of himself." Yeah, we're either frustrated or free. So let's teach our kids self-discipline so that they become free. The road to holiness always goes through trials. And trials for kids sometimes involves discipline and training. And so I think it's important that we remember, we want our kids to grow up to be holy. It's going to have to go through discipline and through trials. One of my favorite resources for this is for instruction of righteousness. If you go to our website, howtohomeschoolmychild.com/F, I, R, you can see my review of this. But basically, it's about 50 chapters, and each chapter is a sin, and there are verses in each for each sin that are applying for that. And it's ways that you can apply it with your kids. And then there's the flip side, the blessings of not doing that sin with verses as well, and objects lessons. There's Bible stories and Bible verses to memorize. And how did I use this to help lay a firm foundation of character? When my kids were young, I would pick a verse and we would read it together depending on whatever the issue was. And a lot of times I would use the object lesson and the idea that they gave. When my kids were older and could read for themselves, let's say arguing, our arguing chapter has many pencil and crayon marks all over it because that was an issue in our family. But arguing, I would tell the two people that were arguing, here's a chapter on arguing. I want you to go pick 3 verses, and then I want you to write down what you learned from each of these. And then that begins to let them see that their issues, the Bible has something to speak about. And so it wasn't just me always dictating and telling them what to do. It was me using an excellent resource, and then that resource was helping them go to the Bible and see that God has something to say about arguing. God has something to say about not obeying. God has something to say about selfishness. And he also has something to say about being a peacemaker and about humility. So I wanted them to be able to start reading the Bible for themselves and coming up with application themselves. So first thing, lay a firm foundation of godly character. Now let's talk a little bit about creating a love of learning. Oh, I will say this. Laying a firm foundation. This resource is completely about character building. In my book, Raising Leaders, Not Followers, there is an entire chapter that I go into more detail about than I have time for here. And I also give some ideas on raising godly character in your kids and specific ways that we did this as a family. I also talk about creating a love of learning. There's 2 or 3 chapters about creating a love of learning. And so you may be going, how do I do it? There's a lot of ways that you can do it. If you are on my 5-day challenge, I sent out a secret chapter, 9 practical tips to develop a love of learning early this morning. But I think one of the biggest things that we can do is give our kids a real life reason why. A lot of times we go through the academics, we go through these subject areas, and our kids don't know why they are learning it. And if we can give them a little bit bigger perspective, and you can do it on their age level, then they may begin to like it a little bit more. They may not love math, because I had 2 girls that didn't love math, but once they understood why they needed to learn math, then that helped them. So why do we teach their kids the Bible? Well, because the Bible has something to say about everything, and because we base our life, every part of our life, on the Bible. Why do we have to learn about character? Sounds like a broken record. Because your character will determine your relationships, whether it's with your friends that you play with right now, whether it's with your, husband or wife, whether it's girlfriends, boyfriends, whatever it is. Character is going to determine your relationship. And with your boss, with your parents. Why do we have to learn to read? Well, in order to pretty much do anything here in our society, you have to read. If you want to learn how to fix a car, you're going to have to do it. If you want to learn how to run the Xbox or the Wii, you might have to learn to read. There's reading involved in everything. Why do I have to learn to write? Because writing is the way that we communicate. And writing is just thinking on paper. And so we do need to learn to write. And you're going to want to write letters as well as maybe have to write at work. Why do I have to learn history? I don't really like that. Well, because history repeats itself, and they made a lot of mistakes in history, and we don't want to repeat those same mistakes. So let's take a look at history. Why do I have to learn math? Well, math is around us everywhere. We use math everywhere, whether it's how much paint to buy to paint your room, whether it's how much money I have to spend out of my allowance. Math is everywhere. And you may be going, how in the world do I tie all of this together? That just seems overwhelming. Well, one way that I found was to be able to use unit studies. Unit studies allow your kids to study a topic of their choice, and then to take all these subject areas and come up with ideas that go around one topic. For instance, astronomy. My kids loved astronomy. My daughters chose to take an astronomy class in high school, and Hunter loved astronomy. So we did, when the girls were taking their class, Hunter and I did a unit on there. So I went to the library and I found books. I made grammar activities out of the books. I would take a chapter of a book he was enjoying, type out a paragraph, and then make some mistakes, and then he had to find those mistakes. We read aloud a biography about Galileo. We did experiments about the solar system. We looked at the math about it. So we looked at the history of also through Galileo. And so I think, you can take whatever your kids are interested in and pull all of this together. Now, I didn't do that all the time, but there were times throughout the year that we would do a unit just so that it was something my kids wanted to study. It wasn't something mom was dictating to them. If you want to know more about unit studies, I have a book, Approaches to Christian Homeschooling. You can go to howtohomeschoolmychild.com/approaches and read more about it. And it's got some stuff in there about unit studies. Another thing about Love of Learning that I really liked was one simple daily activity that we did every day, and that was just to read aloud. Every morning we started with a family group time, and it was about an hour, which you're probably going, oh my gosh, a whole hour? Yep, and my kids had the same reaction when we first started it, because we started in our second year of homeschooling. Read aloud was not happening my first year because I was falling asleep after lunch when I tried reading aloud. And I thought, this gives my kids a bad example of reading. And so I thought, I'm going to redo this. And so I changed it to first thing in the morning. And they were like, what if I don't get my math done? I was like, well, I'm the mom. And so if you don't get your math done, and the reason is because we read aloud, then I'll take care of that. But that never really happened. That was just an excuse. We read aloud through high school, and every morning we would start for about an hour, and the first part was a variety of things that I won't go into, but the last half hour was always reading a classic out loud together, a lot of times just for enjoyment. Every once in a while we would discuss it, or maybe we would discuss that book once during the week. I didn't want to dissect it so much that it took away from the enjoyment of just simply reading aloud. Now, when we read aloud, you need to know that my kids didn't have to sit like perfect little kids on the couch. They had drawing books. My son had a glove and a ball he would throw up in the air. Their hands were busy a lot of times. So don't feel like they need to be sitting perfectly listening. I personally don't listen very well if I'm just sitting there. I have to have something to do with my hands. And so I wanted my kids to have that same opportunity. If you're not sure what books to read, then I would encourage you to look at our Raising Leaders package, because we have some book lists for kids, youth, and adults as well. And so that would be something that you could do. Becky had this to say about our package. She says, thank you for putting together a package that will give me practical tips to go against the tide and serve the Lord and their families, not simply follow the crowd. And that's what leadership education from a Christian perspective is all about. So there are some things that I still want to keep talking about. It's because sometimes we have too many balls to juggle. We need practical tips for daily schooling, simple strategies to give our kids the tools of learning. Or sometimes we're just homeschooling a bunch of kids and it's hard to juggle it all. So I want to share a resource, and then I'm going to go back and I'm going to spend the rest of the time talking about that independent learning, the tools of learning, and the 3 R's that moms absolutely must need to be successful. So, Raising Leaders is a book that came out today on Amazon and Barnes & Noble and all other areas where you can buy books. It is a biblical perspective to leadership education, and it is on sale on Amazon for $11.50. It's 32% off right now. If you purchase by midnight and email me your receipt, I'm going to send you $180 of free homeschool resources. So take a look at that. That's the link, Review-Leaders, where you can go to Amazon. Or if you want to know more about it, you're still not sure, you can go to my homeschool website and hover over resources and homeschooling and get to it. I forgot to include that link, and it's got a long explanation of more details of what's really included. Here are some of the things listed on that page, and you can see we've got more about read aloud time, math books, personalizing homeschooling in the car, routine days, inspiring your kids, motivating your kids, boosting your kids' ability to think, changing your education paradigm, how to start, philosophy and goals, gaps, how to develop a good work ethic in your family, all sorts of things. And So if you do order today, send me that receipt. And these are the $180 worth of resources. You'll get the paperback that you're getting. You'll get the workshop and the transcript for Raising Leaders. You'll get my classic book list that I just mentioned. It's a children's, a youth, and adult list. There's 3 lists there. Help for the Harried Homeschooler is schedules and lists for raising leaders, not followers. Old-fashioned copy work and dictation. If you're struggling with figuring out what to copy or dictate to your kids, this is page after page, and it's all old-fashioned. It's historical sections that you can use. My teaching writing ebook, which has a variety of activities to teach writing. And then finally, the one I like a lot, literature ebook package. These are 7 classics like The Child's History of England, Heidi, Men of Iron, Call of the Wild. So those are some books that you will also get that's in our ebook package. And you can go there to grab your own copy. But I'm not going to talk about that any longer. Let's go back and talk about independent studies and how that really works in a homeschool. Well, let's talk about reproducing ourselves again. We talked about it with character and love of learning. We've got the idea of modeling, which we sort of talked about earlier. You're going to model love of learning. You're going to model character. Independent studies moves more into the mentoring aspect of education. And I'd like to look at Moses for an example, because Moses was frustrated. Everyone was coming to him to make every decision, everything. If anything got done in Israel, Moses was in charge of it. Can you relate? Are people always coming to you in the house? What about this, Mom? What about that, Mom? What about this? Oh, and then you're like, oh, we got to get this done, got to get that done. You feel the burden of everything on your shoulders. Well, in Exodus 18:18, Jethro, his father-in-law, says this: both you and these people who are with you will surely wear yourselves out, for this thing is too much for you. You are not able to perform it by yourself. Sound familiar? We can't homeschool forever by ourselves. We can't do everything for our kids. Listen now to my voice. I will give you counsel, and God will be with you. Stand before God for the people, so that you may bring the difficulties to God, and you shall teach them the statutes and the laws, and show them the way in which they must walk and the work they must do. So first he's going to model. He's going to teach them the laws of God, so that they know what truth is. And then Jethro goes on to say, moreover, you shall select from all the people able men, such as fear God, men of truth, hating covetousness, and place such over them to be rulers of thousands, rulers of hundreds, rulers of 50s, and rulers of 10s. And let them judge the people at all times. Then it will be that every great matter they shall bring to you, but every small matter they themselves shall judge. So it will be easier for you, for they will bear the burden with you. Wow, did you hear that? He chose leaders underneath him. Yes, he had the major responsibility. The big problems were brought to Moses, just like the big problems ought to be brought to Mom and Dad. But we ought to be training our kids to be rulers over smaller groups, smaller areas, just like some of these men were rulers over thousands and hundreds, and some tens. The people went to them first. And that's part of our goal. That's a great example of how this is going to all work. So how do we deal with independent studies? What are some keys to getting your kids to study independently and gain those tools of learning? First of all, I would say they need to set aside time for personal growth. You want to structure the time, not the content. You want them to say, okay, here, we're going to set aside 4 hours a day that you're going to learn and you're going to study. And then you need to start to let them make some choices. Let them make decisions, because they will become leaders. If you are constantly telling them what to study, they are not making decisions for themselves. They are not thinking critically. They are not thinking biblically. All right. So I think it's very important that you set aside time for personal growth. Now, Mom, I would encourage you to set aside time for personal growth as well. I wrote about this in the 2 golden hours. And I think I talked about this in the 5-day challenge, that we have 2 golden hours. And mom, you ought to be using one of those hours for your own personal growth, growth with God, growth academically, growth personally and professionally. And so you need to be modeling as you mentor your kids that you are learning as well. So I would encourage you to then mentor with the classics so that you and your kids are using classic books and you are mentoring them in how to do this. And you may be going, okay, that sounds real nice, real good. How do I do it? This is where you want to give your kids the tools of learning for a lifetime. And in a nutshell, it is read, write, and discuss. Your kids are going to read a book. They're going to write about it each day, and then you are going to discuss it with them. If they are reading a book, then you need to be reading a book so that you can discuss it with them. I would also encourage you to write about it as well. So as a group, you're reading, you're writing, and you're discussing. And I will give you a story. When Ashley read A Tale of Two Cities, I was like, oh, I read that. I loved that book in high school. That was a book that I actually enjoyed. So I just got the Cliff Notes. I'm telling you, we had the worst discussions ever. I'm talking worst discussions ever, because I had not read the actual book. Even though I'd read it in high school, I couldn't remember all the details. The Cliff Notes didn't give me that much. So when Gentry and Hunter came along and we were reading that together, I read A Tale of Two Cities. I got my reading journal out and I wrote about A Tale of Two Cities each time I read it. And my discussions, or our discussions, were much better because it was fresh on my mind. And if it's a classic, it's never going to quit saying what it needs to say. It says a classic is a book that is never finished saying what it has to say. Use the book list in those classic book lists, and you can find classics at all ages. Now I'm talking reading journal more with older kids. With younger kids, I would do something different. But for older kids, they ought to be able to read each day and write in their reading journal and be prepared to discuss. And it's going to make you a greater teacher. This is you mentoring your kids. You are interacting with the text and bonding with your kids. You could pay someone to mentor your kids, but why not strengthen your bond by becoming a mentor, raising a leader and not a follower? And you're probably going, well, we just homeschool. How do we discuss? I would encourage you to use a technique called the Socratic dialogue. And it is essential for leaders because leaders communicate. So they need to learn to communicate in writing. They also need to learn to communicate in verbally. Leaders relate to people. They work with people. They solve problems with people. It's all about people. They need to be able to communicate. So how do we do it? The simplest way I can tell you to use the Socratic dialogue is to think of some questions that you want to ask and never answer your own question. Never answer your own question. Count to 100. Do not answer your own question. And then if they don't answer it, then ask another question. Always asking questions. That's what the Socratic dialogue is all about. Because asking questions does what? It teaches your kids how to think. You've already thought about this question. You already have an answer in your head. You wait 10 seconds because they haven't thought of an answer. You are not teaching your kids how to think. So I think it's really important that you pause and give them time to think. They've never heard of that question before. They haven't had time to think. Give them time to think. That's what the Socratic dialogue is all about. Benjamin Franklin says, reading feeds the brain. It is evident that most minds are starving to death. So not only is our society not reading, they're not thinking. And for the most part, our kids' brains are starving to death if we are not challenging them with classic books. And it is going to take some effort, but it's worth every minute when you think of the outcome. When you have a child who can think outside the box, who can think for themselves, and can call the shots, that child can have an impact for the world for Jesus Christ. Get your children off the conveyor belt and help them to think for themselves. So that's independent studies, but I will say that moms are making a mistake. And we're going to turn to moms right now. What is that biggest mistake? Too often we still want to use a checklist, still worried your kid won't meet up to others' expectations or get into that college, still concerned about productivity, that Woodrow Wilson thing, getting good little worker bees. You see, U.S. is actually very successful in their education system. You're probably going, what in the world is she saying? Yes, the U.S. is actually very successful in their education system. Think about that for a minute. The goal with the education system is not education as we think of it. It is productivity. Think back on Woodrow Wilson. We are too productivity oriented. That's what the education system is all about, developing good worker bees. And this approach drains moms. Aren't you drained when you are just so worried about productivity and you're so concerned about that checklist? Well, let's look at the solution. The solution is the 3 R's, not the 3 R's you're thinking of, but the 3 R's to start school right this year. Relax, rest, and rejoice. You are probably already too worked up over what to teach this coming year anyway. Relax. They're not going to get it all in one year anyway. Take a step back and relax and rest. God calls us to rest. Rest in the Lord and wait patiently for Him. That is so important. And too often we do not rest in the Lord. We rest in productivity, and there is no rest in that. Look at the end goal and then relax and rest and then rejoice in God. Rejoice in the work that He's doing in your family. Rejoice. Start keeping a gratitude journal. Write down just small little things. Hey, the coffee was hot this morning. Oh, the dishes are done. That would be something to be thankful for. The kids didn't argue for 15 minutes after lunch. Look for little things that we can be thankful and grateful for and rejoice in the Lord in that. Take a step back, relax, rest, and rejoice. And go to God. If you are overworked about things or concerned about whether your kid's going to get into college, and if that's a concern of yours, my daughter Ashley didn't know until November after she graduated from homeschool what she wanted to do. And she started college in December. She did it all the non-traditional way. Now, I'm not saying you should do that. My other 2 started college the September after they graduated. But I'm just saying, don't get so worked up. God's got it. He's got you in the palm of His hand. He's not going to let you go. And He has your kids there too. Rest, relax, and rejoice. Look at the end goal with your kids. Wise and virtuous leaders. Get off the conveyor belt. Use questions to get there and make it simple. Just enjoy books together. You may be going, well, how do I start? I would say take one step at a time. Benjamin Disraeli, who is a friend of Queen Victoria, said, to be conscious that you are ignorant of the facts is a great step to knowledge. To know that we don't know what we don't know is actually the first step in homeschooling, because we don't know everything and you're never going to know everything. And to be conscious that you're ignorant of the facts is very important. Don't reinvent the wheel. Look to other people. Follow great leaders. There's step-by-step helps to get you started, to help you start your own personal growth plan, to help you lay a firm foundation, to help you give your kids a love of learning, to help you give your kids the tools of learning and independent study. It is important that you follow great leaders as well. And one of my favorite is Teddy Roosevelt. The reason I like him is he started slow. He had physical problems of asthma, and they weren't sure. He spent a lot of time in bed. And in high school, he was like, I'm going to do something different. And even though he had this horrible asthma, he was willing to do whatever was necessary to accomplish his goal. Nothing was an obstacle for TR, starting with high school and overcoming asthma. But then also he was walking through the woods with the French ambassador one day, and they came to a creek that they couldn't just walk across. So he stripped his clothes down and expected the dignitary to do the same, to swim to the other side and to continue their walk. Nothing was an obstacle for Teddy Roosevelt. He was shot in the chest on his campaign trail, but he gave a speech 1 hour after he was shot with a broken rib and a bullet in the chest. Nothing was an obstacle for Teddy Roosevelt. He wasn't an overnight success. It took years for him to become the president that he became. But I do encourage you to take action, because if you don't take action, your child's the only one that will suffer. Realizing that your action is the first step, and it will take time. So Lisa says, I couldn't figure it out how to implement it, and I wanted a Christian perspective. Thank God for you bringing this all together. And that's what she's saying about raising leaders. So again, if you're interested in more details about any of these topics, then I would encourage you to get Raising Leaders, Not Followers. If you purchase by midnight tonight and send me the receipt sometime this week, I'll send you a link to all the 180 free homeschool resources. And here's the list, and we've already gone over that. Sherry says there's little to nothing available in this area of education that has practical application for homeschooling parents. Thank you for being a voice in the desert that will give guidance to us many lone horses that are headed your way. And Holly says, thank you for implementing this style, even if I have several children. Lots of full practical direction. Here's your $180.75 of resources, your workshop, your transcript, your 3 book lists, your help for the harried homeschool schedulers and lists, old-fashioned copywork and dictation, teaching writing, ebook, and our 7 classics literature ebook package. You can get all of that if you purchase by midnight tonight. If you have questions or anything, please feel free to get on the blog. I'll be getting on the blog off and on today and the rest of this week and answering any questions that you might have. Thank you for spending time with us. Remember, you can go to raising-leaders.com/review-leaders, or you can go to howtohomeschoolmychild.com, click on resources, click on homeschooling, and you'll see a picture of our book, and it will give you a lot of details about this book. If you're unsure, that's where I would go, and I should have put that link down, but I didn't. Thank you so much for spending time with me. I hope you have a great day.